He was a homeless construction worker and father who wanted only one thing for his 6-year-old daughter: not to live on the streets. When they found an abandoned, rusty train, he decided to turn it into a home. But when the authorities found out what he had done, something unexpected happened. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are from. The first sound Michael Hayden heard that morning was the ticking of a leaking faucet somewhere in the kitchen. It was not much of a sound, barely a rhythm, but in the quiet of the small rented apartment, it seemed to echo against the cracked walls. He sat at the edge of the bed for a while, his elbows resting on his knees, staring at the uneven patch of light creeping across the worn floorboards. The air smelled faintly of damp concrete and boiled coffee from the night before. He had meant to fix that faucet weeks ago, but lately everything in his life seemed to leak. Time, strength, hope. In the next room, his daughter stirred. Lily always woke before him, even when he begged her to sleep longer. She was 6 years old, a thin, bright child with hair that never stayed combed and eyes too serious for her age. When she appeared at the doorway clutching the edge of her blanket, she asked, "Daddy, is it morning already?" He nodded and tried to smile, though his smile felt as tired as the light itself. They had lived in that apartment for a year, long enough for the walls to remember them, long enough for him to hate the sound of the neighbors fighting through the thin plaster. It was all he could afford after his wife, Emma, had passed away 2 winters earlier. Her illness had drained everything: the savings, the house, the small construction business he had built with his own hands. Now, the only tools left were rusting in a crate near the door. He made breakfast oatmeal and a single apple sliced in half, and watched Lily eat with the quiet focus of a man measuring what little remained. On the refrigerator hung one of her drawings, a greenhouse under a blue sky, with smoke curling from a chimney and 2 stick figures holding hands in the yard. She had drawn it the week they moved in and told him, "One day, we'll have a real home again." He hadn't known how to answer then, and he still didn't now. When the mail slipped under the door that afternoon, he almost didn't pick it up. Bills, advertisements, reminders. He knew the pattern by heart. But the thick envelope with the red stamp made his stomach tighten. It was the eviction notice. They had 1 week to vacate for unpaid rent. There were no options left. He sat for a long time staring at the paper, the printed words blurring as his vision filled with the memory of Emma's face, the way she used to tell him not to give up, not to let the world take the part of him that still dreamed. But the world had taken so much already. That night, after Lily had fallen asleep, he walked the apartment in silence. He touched the table he had built from scrap wood, the dented kettle, the thin curtains fluttering with the cold draft from the window. He thought about all the rooms he had built for other families, kitchens with marble counters, wide porches, roofs that kept the rain out, and wondered how a man could create homes for others and lose his own so completely. He leaned against the window and looked at the city lights flickering through the drizzle. Somewhere out there, life went on for people who had never been forced to start over. But for him, there was only the sound of trains in the distance and the faint, stubborn beat of his heart refusing to give up. The next morning he packed what little they owned into cardboard boxes: tools, clothes, Lily's stuffed rabbit, a few photographs. When she asked where they were going, he said, "We'll find something better." He tried to sound sure, but his voice cracked on the last word. She didn't question him. She simply took his hand, as if her small fingers could hold his promises together. He walked for hours that day, searching for signs of opportunity: an old garage, a warehouse, anything with a roof. Work had been scarce for months. Construction companies were cutting costs, and men like him were the first to be dismissed. By late afternoon, he found himself near the edge of town, where the old railway tracks disappeared into weeds and rust. He hadn't been there in years. The station had been shut down long before Lily was born. Curiosity, or maybe desperation, drew him closer. The rails stretched into the distance, glinting faintly beneath the gray sky. Between the overgrown bushes, something massive and forgotten stood on the tracks. An old passenger car from another century. Its paint was peeling, its windows shattered, and ivy crept up its sides like veins reclaiming a corpse. The sight stopped him. There was something haunting about the stillness of it, a relic that had outlived its purpose. Yet as he stood there, he felt something stir in his chest, a flicker of recognition, of possibility. He approached carefully, helping Lily climb over a fallen rail. The metal creaked under his hand when he pulled the door open. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the smell of old wood. The seats were torn, the floor uneven, but sunlight streamed through the broken glass, laying stripes of gold across the ruin. Lily's voice echoed softly. "Is this a train?" she whispered, her eyes wide. "It was," he said. She smiled. "Can we live here?" The question startled him. He almost laughed, but something in her tone, innocent, trusting, made him pause. He looked around again, this time not as a stranger, but as a builder. Beneath the decay, he saw the structure, the sturdy steel frame, the symmetry of the windows, the way the space could be divided. He imagined panels of warm wood, a small stove near the corner, maybe even a porch built from the platform outside. It was crazy, impossible, but so was everything else they had survived. That evening, they returned with a flashlight and an old blanket. Lily skipped along the tracks, humming to herself, while he pushed open the door and cleared a spot large enough for them to sit. When night fell, the train groaned in the wind, like a creature remembering its purpose. Through the cracks, they could see stars. He wrapped the blanket around Lily and whispered, "Just for tonight." She nodded sleepily, her head resting on his shoulder. "It's warm," she murmured. He didn't tell her that the warmth came from his own body pressed against hers. As she slept, Michael watched the faint moonlight paint the walls of the carriage. It had been years since he had felt anything close to peace. Maybe it was the quiet, or the way the metal walls seemed to hold them close, but something inside him shifted. This was not a house, not yet, but it was shelter, and for now, that was enough. The next days were filled with movement. He returned to the city to collect discarded materials, planks from abandoned sites, nails, old insulation. People stared at him pushing a cart down the road, but he didn't care. Each nail he found felt like a small step toward dignity. He cleaned the carriage from dawn until dusk, scraping away rust, tearing out the broken seats, washing the windows with rainwater. The work was exhausting, but familiar. His hands remembered how to build, how to measure, how to turn emptiness into form. Lily helped in her own way. She collected wildflowers and placed them in jars along the windowsills, sang songs while he hammered, drew pictures on the walls with bits of chalk. Sometimes she called him Captain and pretended the train was moving through mountains and forests. He played along, telling her stories of places they might one day see. At night, they would light a candle, and she would fall asleep listening to his quiet humming. The first week passed, and the train began to change. The air no longer smelled of decay, but of pine and soap. He covered the floor with wooden boards, built a small bed frame for Lily, and sealed the cracks with strips of cloth. Each improvement filled him with a deep, private joy. He had no permits, no money, no approval, but for the first time in years, he was building something that mattered. When the neighbors from the nearby settlement noticed smoke rising from the chimney he had fashioned out of an old pipe, they came to see. Some shook their heads, calling him mad. A man living in a train, they said, It'll collapse before winter. Others were quietly impressed. He ignored them all. He wasn't building for them. One evening, as the sun bled orange across the horizon, he sat on the steps of the carriage and watched Lily chase fireflies between the weeds. Her laughter drifted through the air, clear and light, and he felt something inside him unclench. The world outside was still uncertain. Rent, work, officials. But here, amid rust and wood and light, he had carved out a space that belonged to them alone. When he put her to bed that night, she asked, "Daddy, is this our home now?" He hesitated, looking around the small room bathed in candlelight. The walls were uneven, the floor still cold, but it felt alive. He brushed a strand of hair from her forehead and said, "Yes, for as long as it needs to be." She smiled and closed her eyes, clutching her stuffed rabbit. Michael sat by the window long after she fell asleep. The moon rose high above the silent tracks, and a faint breeze slipped through the cracks, carrying the smell of earth and rain. He thought about Emma, and wondered what she would think if she could see them now, living in a forgotten train, at the edge of nowhere, surviving on scraps and stubbornness. He liked to imagine she would understand. She had always believed in his hands, in his will to rebuild. As the candle burned low, he realized that something within him had quietly changed. The fear that had haunted him since the eviction notice no longer felt like a weight. It had become fuel. There was still so much to do. Walls to finish, leaks to seal, food to find. But for the first time in years, he could see a path ahead, not paved or certain, but his own. Outside, the rails disappeared into the darkness, swallowed by weeds and distance. They led nowhere, but to him. Nowhere was finally a place worth staying. The night hummed softly with the memory of trains that once passed, and in that sound, he heard the faint rhythm of hope returning. By the time dawn crept over the horizon, Michael Hayden had made up his mind. This abandoned carriage, this forgotten relic of another age, would become their home. Not a stopgap, not a hiding place, a beginning. He stepped outside, breathed in the cold air, and looked at the first light glinting off the rails. Behind him, Lily stirred in her sleep, and for the first time in years, he smiled without pretending. The day ahead would be hard, but he had purpose again. And that, he thought, was enough to build a life on. Winter came quietly, the way dust settles on forgotten things, and the small train at the edge of the town no longer looked like a relic. It looked lived in. Smoke curled from a pipe that Michael had fixed to the roof, and inside the metal shell, warmth gathered like breath in cupped hands. The once rusted walls now wore a patchwork of polished wood panels, each nailed by his own hand, each board telling a story of a day's labor. The smell of pine filled the air, mixing with the faint scent of soap and tea. Lily's drawings were taped along one wall, sunsets, birds, a big green train with hearts floating above it. She had named their home the Train That Stayed. Life had taken on a rhythm again. Michael woke before sunrise, made porridge on the small stove he'd built from scrap metal, and listened to the morning quiet. The world beyond the tracks barely noticed them, but he noticed every small sound. The creak of the carriage when the wind shifted, the faint whistle of trains far away, the soft breathing of his daughter as she slept in the small alcove he'd turned into her room. He often thought that if someone had told him a year ago he'd be living inside an abandoned rail car, he would have laughed. Yet now he could not imagine any other kind of peace. The transformation had been slow, almost stubborn. He'd scavenged for everything: planks from abandoned lots, discarded insulation from construction dumpsters, old windows people had thrown away. His hands were always cut or bruised, but he didn't complain. It wasn't just about making a shelter anymore. He was rebuilding himself. The train became a reflection of his own stubborn endurance, something written off by the world, but still standing. Lily helped in her small ways. She planted marigold seeds in coffee cans outside the door and watched them every morning, impatient for color. She collected smooth stones from the tracks and arranged them in circles, calling them gardens. Every time Michael saw her bent over her small creations, he felt that strange ache in his chest again, the kind that was half pain, half pride. He knew he was not giving her the life Emma had dreamed of, but at least he was giving her a home that belonged to them alone. By late autumn, the inside of the carriage looked nothing like the ruin it once was. A narrow table stood beside the window, built from 2 old doors. A row of hooks held their jackets. A single bulb powered by a small solar panel gave off a weak but steady light. Evenings were their favorite time. They would sit together with tea, Lily wrapped in a blanket, listening to the sound of the rain on the roof. Sometimes she'd fall asleep before the story ended, and he'd carry her to bed, tucking her under the quilt he had patched together from Emma's old clothes. The first snow arrived earlier than expected. It blanketed the rails in silence and turned the clearing around the carriage into a white sea. For a while, the world seemed gentle. But winter has a way of testing things, built by hand. The stove struggled against the cold. The walls groaned as the metal contracted, and thin drafts sneaked in through the seams no matter how carefully he sealed them. One night, a storm rolled in from the north, and the wind shrieked through the valley like something alive. The roof panels rattled, and water began dripping through a joint he hadn't yet repaired. Michael climbed up in the dark, barefoot and half-dressed, holding a piece of tarpaulin. The rain soaked him instantly, and the cold bit into his bones. But he worked as if driven by something larger than himself. Each hammer strike was a prayer, each breath a promise. Inside, Lily watched through the window, her small hands pressed against the glass, her face lit by the flicker of their candle. When he finally came down, shivering and drenched, she wrapped him in the blanket and whispered, "You fixed it, Daddy." He nodded, though his lips were too cold to answer. Days blurred into weeks. The train became a ship weathering its first winter, creaking but unbroken. There were hard moments, frozen pipes, long nights of coughing when the smoke refused to rise, but there were moments of quiet triumph, too. The morning he woke to find sunlight spilling across the walls instead of frost, he felt a strange pride, as if they had conquered something invisible. Spring arrived with mud and wind, and the world began to breathe again. The grass around the tracks grew high, dotted with wildflowers. Michael repaired the fence, built a small wooden deck outside the door, and placed a chair there so Lily could sit and draw. One afternoon, a group of young people appeared near the tracks. They were architecture students, carrying cameras and notebooks. They had heard rumors of the man who lived in a train. They asked to take pictures. He hesitated, but agreed, mostly because Lily seemed delighted by the attention. A week later, his picture appeared on a local website under the headline, "Builder Turns Abandoned, Train into Family Home." The story spread quickly, shared by people who like to see hope in unexpected places. Journalists began showing up some kind, some only curious. He found their presence uncomfortable, but he answered their questions simply. "I built a house because I had no choice. You do what you can with what you have." When they asked if he considered himself an innovator, he said, "No, I'm a father." The attention brought both kindness and unease. Some neighbors offered tools, food, and even books for Lily. Others shook their heads and muttered that he was trespassing on land that didn't belong to him. He tried not to think about it, but the worry lingered. One morning, a letter arrived tucked beneath the door, a government notice from the Department of Transportation. The land around the tracks was slated for environmental clearance. The train, listed as an unauthorized structure, was to be removed within 30 days. Michael read the letter 3 times, each word pressing heavier against his chest. He had known, somewhere deep down, that the day might come. But knowing it and facing it were different things. When Lily asked why he looked sad, he said only that grown-up people sometimes make mistakes. She didn't understand, but she climbed into his lap and said, "Don't worry, Daddy. We can fix it. You fix everything." He held her tightly, unable to answer. That night he sat outside long after she had gone to bed. The stars were sharp and cold above him. The train creaked in the breeze like an old friend trying to speak. He thought of all the things he had built in his life. Houses, walls, rooms that kept out the wind, and how none of them had ever felt as alive as this place. He imagined men in suits signing papers somewhere far away, deciding that their little home was a problem to be erased. The idea made him angry in a way he hadn't felt in years. He realized then that this was no longer about shelter. It was about belonging. In the days that followed, he tried to fight quietly. He wrote letters to the city, explaining that the land was abandoned and that he had restored something instead of destroying it. He asked for permission to stay. There was no reply. When the local journalist came again, he told her the truth. "They want to tear it down," he said. "But this train saved my life. I won't leave it." She recorded his words, and within a week, they were quoted everywhere. People began visiting again, neighbors, reporters, strangers with cameras. Some brought paint, others brought food. A few just wanted to shake his hand. A woman from a local university offered to help him file a petition. Someone painted the words, "Home is where you build it," on the side of the train. He didn't know who, but he left it there. It felt right. Still, the pressure from the authorities grew. Another notice arrived, more severe this time. The demolition was scheduled for the first day of summer. He kept the paper hidden from Lily, but she sensed the tension. "Are they coming to take our house?" she asked one evening. He tried to smile. "No one can take what's real," he said softly. "And this is real." In the last week before the deadline, he poured all his strength into repairs. He reinforced the roof, built new steps, planted flowers in wooden boxes outside. Every act of creation felt like defiance, like a message carved into time. We exist. We matter. The nights grew shorter, filled with the scent of wood smoke and fresh paint. One evening, as the sun sank behind the hills, Lily ran out of the carriage carrying a small sign she had made from cardboard. On it, she had written, in crooked letters, "The Hayden Home." She taped it to the door, proud and serious. He watched her and felt a lump in his throat. "It's official now," she said, grinning. He nodded. "Yes, it is." As darkness fell, they sat together on the steps, listening to the hum of the insects and the faraway sound of a train passing somewhere beyond the hills. Michael thought about how strange life was, that something abandoned could become a symbol of hope, that the simplest dream could grow into something too strong to erase. The letter from the government still lay on his table, but for the first time, he didn't feel powerless. The world might see this place as scrap metal and rust, but to him, it was sacred. He looked at his daughter, her hair glinting in the firelight, and realized that even if they lost the train tomorrow, something had already changed forever. They had learned how to stand still in a world that kept moving. The wind rustled through the grass, carrying the faint smell of rain. He felt it on his face and whispered almost to himself, "Let them come." The words did not sound like surrender, but like resolve. He would fight not with anger, but with the quiet, unshakable force that had built every beam, every wall, every dream in this place. Inside, the candlelight flickered over Lily's drawings, over the rough boards that glowed like gold. The home trembled slightly as the night deepened, alive in every nail and seam. Michael closed the door, checked the latch, and listened to the steady breathing of his daughter. The storm that was coming no longer frightened him. He knew that whatever happened, this house on the rails, this miracle born of rust and love, would move again, not on wheels, but in the hearts of those who had seen it shine against the dark. The morning of the demolition was too quiet. The kind of silence that waits, coiled, before it breaks. Mist hung over the tracks like breath held in the cold, and the grass around the carriage glistened with dew. Inside, the little stove had gone out, and the air was cold enough to see one's breath. Michael woke before dawn, though he hadn't truly slept. He sat for a long while at the edge of the bed, staring at the folded letter on the table, the official order to vacate and surrender the structure. The ink was already smudged at the corners from where his hands had pressed against it too long. He'd read the same words so many times that they no longer seemed real. Lily stirred under the blankets, half asleep, half dreaming. "Daddy," she mumbled, "is it morning?" He nodded. "It is." He didn't tell her that this morning was supposed to end everything. He moved quietly through the narrow space, stoking the fire back to life, boiling water, pretending that it was just another day. But the weight of the hours pressed on him with the slow certainty of an approaching train. By mid-morning, they heard the sound of an engine in the distance. A truck. 2 men in orange vests stepped out when it arrived, followed by another in a dark coat, who looked like he had never held a tool in his life. They spoke among themselves, checking papers, their voices carried on the wind. Michael stood by the doorway, his hands tucked in his jacket pockets to keep them from trembling. He didn't speak until the man in the coat walked closer and said, "Mr. Hayden?" "Yes," Michael answered. "I'm here under the order of the Department of Transportation. You were notified. This area is not zoned for residents. I'm afraid we have to proceed today." Michael looked at the man, then back at the train. The panels he had sanded, the windows he had cleaned, the steps Lily had painted yellow with her tiny hands. He felt something rise inside him, a heat that wasn't anger, but something stronger. "You can't take it," he said quietly. The man sighed. "I'm sorry, sir. You don't have the right to occupy this land. It's not safe. We have instructions." Lily stepped out then, clutching her stuffed rabbit. "Please don't take our home," she said, her voice trembling. The man froze for a moment, then looked away. "Sweetheart," he said softly, "I just work here." That was the moment everything changed. The workers hesitated. Michael didn't move aside. He stood at the doorway, not defiant in the loud way, but with the stillness of a man who had decided that nothing would move him. Cameras appeared before he even knew they'd been called. Someone must have seen the trucks coming and told the local reporters. Within half an hour, the edge of the clearing was crowded with neighbors and strangers holding up phones. A woman shouted, "Let him stay!" Someone else yelled, "It's his home!" The man in the coat stepped back, uneasy. "Sir, please," he said, his tone faltering. "We're just trying to do our job." "So am I," Michael said, his voice calm but firm. "This is my job now, to protect what's mine." For a long moment, no one moved. The truck's engine idled, its hum low and uncertain. The mist was lifting, and sunlight spilled across the rails, catching on the paint Lily had brushed on the door. The Hayden home. The letters shimmered faintly, like a quiet declaration of belonging. By noon, reporters had set up microphones. The story spread fast first through the town, then across the state. A man and his daughter, refusing to abandon the home they built from an abandoned train. The image was powerful. A father standing guard before a structure made of rust and hope. When one journalist asked him what he would do if they forced him out, he said. "Then I'll build it again. You can take the land, but not the hands that built it." The news hit the internet that night. Videos of Lily holding her rabbit beside the painted door filled social feeds. Captions calling her the girl who lives in the train. Messages poured in from strangers offering donations, lawyers, architects, volunteers. Michael didn't know what to do with the attention, but he was grateful for the kindness that began to flow their way. Days turned into weeks. The demolition was postponed, while the department reviewed the case. Journalists kept visiting, and the story became a conversation about more than just one man's fight. People began asking bigger questions: why so many abandoned spaces were left to rot while families slept in cars, why the laws protected decay but not rebuilding. A local university contacted Michael. They proposed turning his project into a study of sustainable living, how reuse could become renewal. He hesitated at first. He didn't trust institutions. But when they offered to help him file for legal stewardship of the land, he agreed. A team of volunteers came to reinforce the structure. They repainted the walls, installed proper insulation, added solar panels. The once-forsaken train began to look almost new, though Michael insisted they keep some of the old metal exposed. It should remember what it was, he said. By midsummer, the air around the tracks was alive with the sound of hammers and voices. Other old carriages, once scattered and rusting, were dragged closer. People wanted to help turn them into homes for others, like him. Single parents, veterans, people who had lost everything. He worked tirelessly, teaching anyone who came how to measure wood, how to seal windows, how to make things last. The place that had once been a symbol of isolation became a heartbeat of community. Lily grew alongside it. She had friends, now children, who came to play near the rails, to help paint walls or plant flowers. She loved showing them the deck her father had built, telling them stories about the nights they had spent listening to storms. Sometimes Michael would catch her explaining, in her proud, serious way, that our house used to move, but now it stays still so we can dream. It wasn't easy. Bureaucracy moved slower than any train. There were still threats, still papers to sign, still inspections to endure. But the momentum of people's belief had shifted the tide. The government could no longer erase what had become a story larger than one man's stubbornness. When the final approval came, a permit granting them the right to maintain the site as a community living project, Michael didn't cheer. He simply sat on the steps of the carriage, breathing deeply, feeling the weight of relief settle over him like warmth. In the months that followed, new structures appeared beside the original train. Some were smaller, others built from shipping containers or reclaimed wood. They called the place Railside Village. A sign at the entrance read, "Built by hands that refuse to give up." The area became a quiet refuge, not grand or modern, but real alive with stories, gardens, and laughter. Michael never stopped working. He repaired roofs, guided volunteers, and still woke before dawn to make tea. But sometimes, when he had a moment to himself, he would walk down the tracks where the rails disappeared into the grass. The sound of distant trains always filled him with a strange mix of sadness and gratitude. They reminded him of motion, of all the places he could have gone if he had chosen escape instead of rebuilding. Yet standing there, looking back at the row of lights glowing softly from the carriages, he knew he had made the right choice. One evening, as the sun melted into the horizon and the air smelled of warm earth, Lily came to sit beside him on the steps. She was older now, taller, her hair catching the light. She held one of her old drawings, the same green house she'd drawn years ago when they still lived in the apartment. Only now she had added tracks beneath it. "Look," she said proudly, "I made it move. He looked at the picture for a long time. "That's beautiful," he said. "Daddy," she asked after a pause, "is our train still moving?" He smiled faintly, gazing at the rail stretching into the distance. "Yes," he said softly, "but not the way it used to." They sat in silence, watching the evening settle over the land. The sky deepened into violet, and the lanterns from the nearby homes flickered like stars fallen close to earth. Somewhere, far off, a train whistle sounded, a long, mournful note that seemed to belong both to the past and to what lay ahead. Michael thought of Emma then, of the woman who had once believed in his hands when no one else did. He hoped she could see them now, how their daughter laughed freely, how the home they built had become more than shelter, how from ruin had come purpose. He imagined her standing on those distant tracks, smiling through the twilight. The night settled fully, and Lily leaned her head against his shoulder. Around them, the sound of life continued. Hammers, laughter, music from a nearby radio. The rails gleamed faintly under the moon, stretching beyond sight, a reminder of where everything had begun. Michael closed his eyes, breathing in the scent of wood and smoke and grass. For the first time in years, he felt completely at peace. No papers, no orders, no walls of concrete or laws could define what they had made here. This place was not granted. It was earned. When he opened his eyes, the lights from the other carriages shimmered through the darkness like a constellation. The home they had built was no longer just theirs. It was a map of resilience, a testament to how far a heart could travel without moving at all. And as the night deepened, the old train seemed to hum again, not with the sound of engines, but with memory, the sound of a man who refused to run, a little girl who believed in him, and a home that, against all odds, refused to be taken. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe for more. Watch the next video to discover another story that might change the way you see the world. And don't forget to share this one. Someone out there might need it today.